Hey, I'm just going to start this.
This is a map of Europe's mass transit railway system across 33 countries. The yellow lines indicate the presence of a train line, and as you can see, it's very dense. There are hardly any spaces where there isn't any coverage for railways. Now, if we compare this to a map of railroad tracks in the US, it's a different story. While parts of the US have some good mass transit, there are large areas of the country which isn't covered by Amtrak, the nation's largest passenger railroad service. But let me show you another map, this time of high-speed rail in Europe. Now obviously, high-speed railways aren't going to be as common as regular speed railways as they require excellent design, strict planning, and massive investment. And yet, as we can see, high-speed rail is present in Europe, which is a stark contrast to the US, as you can see from this map. While the US does have some higher speed rail, like the Aquila line in the Northeastern Corridor, it's hardly an effective map of transport solutions. And the
Washington,
Aquila
DC.
line isn't really that fast either. It can reach about 150 miles per hour, but averages less than 70. This is not the case for Europe's insanely well-designed railroad system. And you have to remember that Europe's system accomplishes this while spanning 33 different nations in a very diverse continent. And I know what you're probably...
Instead of comparing the continent of Europe to the country of the United States, an interesting comparison could be US and Canada, because they are both fairly large countries in size, but Canada does have a slightly better public transit system. Maybe he'll probably get into that, and I spoke too soon. But yeah, I've lived on both continents, North America and Europe. I'm trying to think now, though, what cities in the States have really good public transit. Or I'll settle for decent. He pictured DC and Boston, and then New York, one of the best, if not the best, San Francisco, Chicago. What else? I feel that I'm surely missing some. I think the strict zoning laws in the US make it that cities are just so spread out that it's hard to walk to most places. That, and then culturally, it's just not seen the same to be walking or taking public transport in the States as it is in most European cities. I mean, I've been places in the US where when you see someone walking, it's kind of weird. You know that song, actually? Who sings that? Walking in LA? I can't remember the singer. But that song's from the 80s. And now there are probably way more Metrolink lines in LA than there was then. And still, most people drive in LA. So not much has changed. Actually, write down which you prefer, taking public transport, or would you prefer to drive yourself and have your own car and everything that comes with that? And then if you do prefer public transport, is that an option in your city?
Thinking. This is just because Europe is smaller than the United States, which simply isn't true. While the European Union is smaller than the US, continental Europe has an area that is about 1.04 times as much as the US. So we can dismiss this argument that the United States can't be that well designed because it's too big. Europe simply is better designed. But if you're American, you might not understand why railroad tracks or public transport as a whole is so important. I mean, driving a car works fine, right? Well, no, and Europe showcases why a primary focus on private transportation is so detrimental to a well-functioning transit system. Look at these maps. They show the US road network versus the EU's. And as you can see, the EU's road network is not nearly as impressive as the US's. And yet, when you look at some of the most congested cities in the world, European countries don't feature particularly prominently in the global rankings. This is pretty shocking information because you'd assume that the country with a more expansive road network has a lot less congestion, especially considering the United States has devoted lots of time and money to their highways. So how come Europe is less congested when they have fewer roads? Well, it all comes down to disincentivizing the use of cars and, most importantly, making an attractive alternative. Europe does this by having both private and public transportation infrastructure, which technically the US has as well, it's just a lot worse. But on top of this, Europe makes it pretty expensive to buy, own and use a car. This is achieved by having high taxes on vehicles and gasoline. In fact, here's a map of worldwide gasoline prices. As you can see, European nations are in the top rankings, while the US lies at the bottom, charging very little.
Average gasoline prices worldwide, but this is from 2021. Netherlands, Italy, France, Norway, UK, Germany, Sweden, and then you go into Asia with Japan and South Korea. And then Turkey, Mexico, Colombia, and then the US. So this is what, the top 13.
But let me be very clear, it's only a good idea to make it expensive to drive a car if you have an attractive alternative, which America doesn't, but Europe does. I mean, obviously this wouldn't work in the US with its current transportation infrastructure, but in Europe, this is a great strategy because you make the roads less congested for those who actually need them and give everyone else an affordable and efficient alternative, being Europe's amazing public transport like the trains on the railways. This is arguably the better strategy because even though the vast majority of Americans have access to vehicles at around 91% and gas is comparatively cheap, it still leaves 9% who don't have access to vehicles. What are these people who can't afford a car supposed to do? I mean, sometimes public transport isn't even an option or simply too expensive for many. So you've now actively excluded those who aren't exactly the most well off from society. To make matters worse, some US cities actually got rid of their public transport to make room for more cars. I'm not joking. American streetcars like trams were actually removed to make way for bigger roads. Absolutely insane. Compare that to Oslo, Berlin, and Madrid, where discussions are underway to restrict or even exclude most cars from the city center. And let's not forget that when you have cars, you also need somewhere to park them.
That's how in Beijing, or similar to how in Beijing, you can only drive your car in the city certain days of the week depending on the numbers of your license plate. I always wondered if that made people buy more cars, because then maybe I'd have one car with a license plate ending in an odd number, one in an even, so I could drive into the city every day. Or else it's just quite inconvenient if you live far away from where you work. I'll look into that and I'll link whatever I find. But the US did used to have a really good streetcar system, and now whatever's left of that is just kind of a tourist attraction. Or at least the only one I've ever seen, which is in San Francisco, has just become a tourist attraction. You don't actually use it to get to anywhere in a timely manner.
And this is where things start to become rather ridiculous. You see, the United States has 2 billion parking spaces for 250 million cars. That's 8 parking spaces per vehicle. In Europe, it's pretty much a 1-to-1 with around 250 million public parking spaces for 300 million cars. But to emphasize the ridiculousness of this even further, the area that the US dedicates for car parking is actually larger than the area dedicated for housing people. It's honestly unbelievable that people are being squeezed out of American cities due to regulators wanting to make more room for parking spaces. This simply wouldn't fly in the EU, as it has a whole policy dedicated to improving urban planning. See, the EU spent 115 billion euros between 2014 and 2020 to improve city design by making it smarter, greener, and more connected. Simply meaning they allocated funds to make their cities more efficient, more connected, and better for the environment. And better for the environment they really are, as the average resident in a typical Western US city, such as Los Angeles or Phoenix, contributes approximately 6 times more carbon to the atmosphere per capita than an average European city resident. This is purely the result of not having effective transport solutions, which saves resources and allows people to move about efficiently. And exactly that, moving about efficiently, is something most of Europe's citizens are able to do as a result of the European Union. See, most of Europe's nations are in the European Union, which gives the EU citizens a number of perks, which includes a free travel area. This has been one of the most important achievements of the EU, as it makes it possible for an EU citizen to travel freely to other EU member states and stay for up to 3 months. All they need is a passport or even just an ID card. No visas, no trips to embassies, no form filing, just head straight over.
I remember a lot of my friends the year after high school went traveling with this Interrail pass, where you could go by train through most, if not all, of the countries in Europe. And it's quite flexible. You can choose your dates, and relatively cheap as well. If they had that in Asia or in South America, I'd be all over it.
Makes it incredibly easy to travel, study, and work in other countries and communities. And having this level of centralization is very important to good design, as it gives the smartest people the opportunity to work where they are most useful. And since good design obviously requires a lot of complicated problem solving and planning, this is very smart. Another smart thing is the incredible biking infrastructure we see in Europe, perfectly illustrated by this map of bike path density in Europe. All the purple lines are bike paths, and there's clearly a lot of them, especially towards the left side of the map, but that's just because this is the home of the Dutch, the Netherlands. Now, the funny thing is, I won't be able to compare this to a map of bike path density in the United States, because such a map hasn't been made. At least I wasn't able to find any, and I can only wonder why. But anyway, what Europe and also the European Union has achieved is pretty remarkable, as it's hard to think of another set of such diverse countries where you would be able to travel so freely, in an efficient and inexpensive manner. I mean, you can literally get from Paris to Amsterdam, for example, in just 3 hours for around $30. Imagine being able to travel all over Asia without any border crossings, checks, or visas, and being able to stay for months at a time. That would be truly amazing. And let's not forget that European design has always been distinctive and very successful. In fact, the continent's history of design and interconnectedness serves as a model for the rest of the world. But even though Europe and the EU are pretty great and have amazing infrastructure, they obviously aren't perfect. And I'd love to hear some of the reasons it might not be, so leave a comment down below if you have some thoughts on this. But that's it for this video, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Alright, thank you for sending this one in. It was a subscriber request. The channel's called OBF. First I've seen from them. But I'll make sure to link the channel and the video in the description for you. There are probably a lot of factors as to why the US puts such an emphasis on the automobile industry as opposed to public transport. And now it's such a big part of the manufacturing sector, I kind of doubt it's going to change anytime soon. But for me, they're just both very different places. Each have pros and cons depending on the city we're talking about. I've traveled more in Europe than I have states in the US, but from my limited perspective, I've seen that there are just better public transit options in most European cities. With rural areas kind of being an equalizer though, because, for example, when I lived in Madrid, I lived in the center, so I could take the metro or walk, or maybe the night bus when the metro closed 90% of the time, and then the rest of the time I would take an Uber. But my friends who lived an hour and a half outside of the city in Guadarrama, Cercedia, they had cars that they would drive into Madrid every day for work and around their own neighborhoods because houses were more spread out and public transit was more limited over there. And actually those two places I mentioned, I wouldn't class as rural exactly, they just weren't central. Small towns maybe, which is not altogether different than what you would experience in Southern California, where there are buses and trains and a metro link. It's just that it's not the most convenient way to get around, so most people don't. Actually, if you're from a small town in Europe, whichever country, how is your public transport looking? And just leave your opinions on public transportation in general. I'm also going to link these videos I watch sometimes on YouTube that review luxury trains. Usually speed isn't a factor in these reviews, but some of the sleeper trains have amazing interiors. The Orient Express goes through multiple countries in Europe. And actually, what are the other Belmont trains that are beautiful? The Andean Explorer goes through the Andes. Pullman is in the UK. The Twilight Express in Japan is also really beautiful. If you end up watching those, let me know which one you like the best. But I can't talk about the Orient Express without giving you Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. The storyline's in the title. There's a murder on the train. It's a Poirot detective novel. It turns out to be a whodunit. Highly recommended. I think it's Agatha Christie's best book. And what's another one? I had one in mind. Oh yeah, I just finished Tarantula. It's a sci-fi novel, French author. The storyline goes that a plastic surgeon, he's holding a woman against her will in a bedroom. Simultaneously, there's a bank robber who wants to go to this plastic surgeon and get his face rearranged in order to attempt to escape the law. And then the stories intersect and go on from there. But Almodovar actually made that into a film called The Flesh I Live In, I believe. If that's not the exact wording, it's something very similar. But if you've ever seen that film or you've read that book, tell me what you think about it. The first song is the one I mentioned before, Walking in LA. The artist was Missing Persons. This probably falls into 80s pop rock. But one of the lyrics goes, someone just about to do the freeway strangler, shopping cart pusher, maybe someone groovy, but one thing's for sure, he isn't starring in movies because he's walking in LA, and nobody walks in LA. That's not the tune of the song. I'm saving you by not singing it for you. But I think it's a good cultural reflection of how walking is perceived in some part of the States. And for the second song, we'll stick with Spain. There's an artist called Setangana. He's probably Spanish pop, sometimes rap. The song I'm thinking of is Un Veneno. This is from his Madrileño album. If you listen to it, let me know what you think. And if you can think of a song that's on today's subject, tell me. I always look at the song recommendations. Other than that, that's really all I have. So, thank you for watching with me, and I'll catch you in the next video.